I wasn't sure what made us take the old, forgotten road that cut through the dense forest that day. Maybe it was the allure of adventure, the thrill of the unknown, or just plain bad luck. Sarah and I were heading back from a weekend in the mountains when our car started sputtering, the engine coughing before finally dying on us. We were miles from civilization, the sun dipping low behind the towering pines that closed in on either side. "Looks like we're walking," I said, trying to keep the worry out of my voice as I glanced at Sarah. She was already fidgeting with her phone, but I knew what she'd find. No signal. We had no choice but to leave the car behind and venture into the forest, hoping to find help before nightfall. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that weighs on you, making every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves feel like a gunshot. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers overhead, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a narrow path, half hidden by the underbrush. The path wound deeper into the woods, and though every instinct screamed to turn back, we were too desperate to heed the warning. The air was getting colder, the light fading fast, and we needed to find shelter. Then we saw it, a small cabin, tucked away in a clearing, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Relief washed over me. We hurried toward it, the looming trees giving way to the dim glow of the cabin's windows. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the stillness. It took a moment before the door creaked open, revealing a man who looked like he had stepped out of another century. His hair was long and gray, his face weathered like old leather, and his eyes, those eyes were cold, flat, like the depths of a frozen lake. "What do you want?" His voice was a low growl, rough and unwelcoming. "Our car broke down," I said quickly. "We just need somewhere to stay for the night, and then we'll be on our way in the morning." He stared at us for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded. "Come in." The cabin was small and cluttered, filled with the kind of old, worn furniture that suggested it had been there for generations. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The man, he never gave us his name, motioned for us to sit at the small table near the fire. "You can stay here tonight," he said gruffly, "but don't go wandering off. The woods aren't safe after dark." A shiver ran down my spine at his words. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the look on his face silenced me. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, her eyes wide with unease. As the night wore on, the man was mostly silent, keeping to himself, occasionally glancing toward the door as if expecting someone or something. The fire was the only source of warmth, its light flickering weakly as the wind howled outside. After a meager dinner of stale bread and cold meat, the man finally spoke again. "You'll stay in the room at the end of the hall. Don't open the basement door." His tone was final, brooking no argument. Sarah and I nodded, grateful for the shelter but unnerved by his warning. As we made our way to the room, I couldn't help but notice the thick, reinforced door at the end of the hall, its heavy lock gleaming in the dim light. The basement. We settled into the small bedroom, the bed creaking under our weight. Sarah was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she tried to get comfortable. "This place gives me the creeps," she whispered. "Me too," I admitted. "But it's just for one night. We'll leave at first light." I tried to reassure her, but there was a knot of fear tightening in my gut. Something about this place was wrong, very wrong, and the more I thought about it, the more I wondered what could be so dangerous in the basement that it needed to be locked away. As the night deepened, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the windows. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with unease. At some point I heard it, a faint noise like a low moaning, rising up through the floorboards. I sat up, straining to listen, but it faded into the wind. Then there was a creak, the sound of a door opening. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep. I held my breath, listening as the creaking grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps in the hall. The footsteps stopped outside our door. My breath caught in my throat as the door handle slowly turned. It opened just a crack, enough for me to see a sliver of the dark hallway beyond. I expected to see the old man, but instead there was nothing, just darkness. And then, from that darkness, something moved. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. Sarah jolted awake, fear flashing in her eyes as I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The footsteps had retreated, but the sense of dread was suffocating. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Someone or something was outside the door," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't think we're alone here." We sat in silence, the tension thick in the air. After what felt like an eternity, the moaning sound returned, louder this time, echoing up from below. The basement. I knew we should stay put, wait out the night, but the sound was drawing me, pulling me toward that locked door. Curiosity warred with fear, but in the end, curiosity won. I had to know what was down there. "I'm going to check it out," I said, standing up. Sarah grabbed my arm, her grip tight with fear. "Are you crazy? He told us not to go down there." "I know, but something's not right. I just need to see." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." I crept out into the hall, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind outside. The door to the basement loomed at the end of the hall, its lock gleaming in the dim light. My heart was pounding as I reached for it, half expecting the old man to appear and stop me. But the hall remained empty, the cabin silent. The lock was old and heavy, but it opened with a creak, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs leading down into darkness. I grabbed a lantern from a nearby shelf, lighting it with shaky hands before descending into the basement. The air grew colder as I went down, the smell of damp earth and something else, something foul, growing stronger. The stairs ended in a small, dirt-floored room, its walls lined with old shelves filled with rusted tools and dusty jars. But it was what sat in the center of the room that made my blood run cold. A large iron cage, its bars thick and reinforced, sat in the middle of the floor. Inside was a figure hunched, emaciated, its limbs twisted and misshapen. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the lantern light, were wide and filled with a mixture of fear and rage. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern as the figure lunged at the bars, letting out a guttural, inhuman scream. It was a man, or at least it had been, but now it was something else entirely, something twisted and monstrous. And then I heard it, a low growl from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, to see the old man standing at the bottom of the stairs, a shotgun in his hands. His eyes were cold, devoid of any humanity. "I told you not to come down here," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Who? What is that?" I stammered, pointing to the creature in the cage. "He was my brother," the old man said, his gaze never leaving mine. "But he's not anymore. The woods took him, turned him into that thing." The creature let out another scream, rattling the bars of its cage, its eyes wild with madness. The old man sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "The woods, they change people. They took my brother years ago, and I've been keeping him down here ever since, trying to contain it." I couldn't breathe, my mind racing as I tried to process what he was saying. Why didn't you kill it?" The old man's expression hardened. "He's still my brother, even if there's nothing left of him. And besides, killing him wouldn't stop the woods. It wouldn't stop them." "Them?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The creatures in the woods. They're the ones who did this to him, and they're always looking for more." She asked, her voice trembling. "We need to barricade the door," the old man said, ignoring her question. "Now." We scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut and piling whatever we could find in front of it, furniture, boxes, anything heavy enough to hold it closed. The howls were just outside now, circling the cabin, their feral cries reverberating through the walls. And then the banging started. It was as if a dozen fists were pounding on the walls, the windows, the door, trying to break in. The entire cabin shook with the force of it, the sound deafening. "They're going to get in," Sarah cried, her eyes wide with terror. The old man shook his head, his face grim. "We just have to hold out until dawn. They can't stand the light." But dawn was hours away, and the creatures outside were relentless, their assault growing more violent by the minute. The door cracked, the wood splintering under the force of their blows. And then, with a deafening crash, the front window shattered, and they were inside. The old man fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the cabin, but it was no use. The creatures swarmed in, their twisted, monstrous forms filling the small space, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. We fought, but it was hopeless. They were too many, too strong. I watched in horror as one of the creatures dragged Sarah to the floor, its jaws closing around her neck, blood spraying across the walls. I tried to reach her, but the old man pulled me back, his grip like iron. "Run," he shouted, shoving me toward the back door. "There's no saving her now." I hesitated, torn between running and trying to save her. But the look in his eyes told me there was no hope. I turned and fled, bursting out of the cabin and into the cold, dark woods. The howls followed me, the creatures chasing me through the trees, their glowing eyes burning into my back. I ran blindly, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, but no matter how fast I ran, they were always right behind me. And then, just as the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, the howls stopped. I stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion. The creatures were gone, vanished with the night, leaving me alone in the forest. But as I stood there, panting and bleeding, I realized the truth. I wasn't free. The woods had let me go, but they had taken something from me, something I could never get back. I was one of them now, a part of the forest, bound to it by the blood that had been spilled. I could feel it in my bones, in my soul. The darkness had seeped into me, changing me, twisting me. And as I stood there, watching the sun rise over the trees, I knew I would never leave this place. The woods had claimed me, just as they had claimed the old man's brother, just as they had claimed Sarah. And one day, when the sun set and the howls began again, I would be one of them. My name is Jake Winters, and I've always been drawn to the dark corners of the world, the places most people avoid. Maybe it's the thrill of the unknown or the challenge of confronting fear head-on, but whatever it is, I can't stay away. That's how I found myself in the heart of a forgotten town, staring up at the crumbling facade of an abandoned asylum that had been closed for decades. The asylum, officially known as Blackwood Institute, was infamous even in its day. Opened in the early 1900s, it was originally a place of hope, a facility where those suffering from mental illness could receive treatment. But things changed when Dr. Victor Grayson took over. Rumors spread about the horrific experiments he conducted, patients disappearing, and strange, unexplained deaths. By the time the authorities shut it down, the place had already gained a sinister reputation. For years, Blackwood had stood silent, its windows dark, its halls empty, but the stories never stopped. They said the spirits of those who died there still roamed the corridors, trapped in eternal torment. Some even claimed that Dr. Grayson's spirit lingered as well, forever searching for new subjects to continue his work. It was exactly the kind of place that called to me. When I mentioned the idea of spending a night there to my friends, they were hesitant at first. But the allure of exploring a place so steeped in legend was too strong to resist. There were 4 of us. Me, my girlfriend Lisa, her brother Tom, and our friend Sarah. We were experienced urban explorers, having spent countless nights in forgotten buildings and abandoned structures. But none of us had ever faced something like Blackwood. We arrived just before sunset, the sky a dull gray heavy with the promise of rain. The town itself was a ghost, its streets empty, the buildings boarded up and decaying. Blackwood stood at the edge of town, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to close in around it, as if nature itself was trying to bury the place. The front gates were rusted but still standing, creaking loudly as we pushed them open. The path leading up to the asylum was overgrown, the once grand entrance now choked with weeds and ivy. The building loomed above us, its windows dark and empty, like the hollow eyes of a skull. "We really doing this?" Tom asked, his voice wavering slightly as he looked up at the imposing structure. "Hell yeah," I said, trying to keep my own nerves in check. "It's just an old building. We've seen worse." Lisa shot me a look, her eyes narrowed. "Worse maybe, but not haunted." I grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, you don't really believe that, do you?" "It's just stories." "Stories have to start somewhere," Sarah muttered, clutching her flashlight tightly. We approached the front doors, which were surprisingly intact. With some effort we forced them open, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a gunshot. The air inside was cold, much colder than it had any right to be, and carried a faint, musty smell of rot and decay. The lobby was just as we'd imagined, peeling paint, broken furniture, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. It was clear that no one had been here in a long time, but there was something else, a feeling, a sense of being watched. We set up our gear in the lobby, laying out sleeping bags and unpacking our cameras. The plan was to explore the building, document what we found, and spend the night. Easy enough, or so we thought. As night fell, the building seemed to come alive. Strange noises echoed through the halls, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of footsteps, and once a faint, eerie laugh that sent chills down my spine. We tried to brush it off, attributing it to the building settling or the wind. But the tension was palpable. We decided to split up to cover more ground, a decision I would come to regret. Lisa and I took the east wing, while Tom and Sarah headed west. The halls were long and winding, lined with empty rooms that once held patients, now filled with nothing but dust and memories. We passed by a nurse's station, the counters covered in old papers and medical supplies, long since forgotten. As we moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder, and that feeling of being watched intensified. I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to dart just out of sight, always gone when I turned to look. "Did you see that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "See what?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "There, down the hall," she said, pointing with a trembling hand. I followed her gaze and saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hall, shrouded in darkness. It was barely visible, just a silhouette, but I knew immediately that it wasn't one of us. I took a step forward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Hello, who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared around a corner. "Jake, we need to go," Lisa said, her voice urgent. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, let's get back to the others." We retraced our steps, moving quickly through the darkened halls. The building seemed to twist and shift around us, the layout no longer making sense. Every turn we took led us deeper into the asylum, further away from the lobby. "Where the hell are we?" Lisa asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to stay calm. "Just keep moving." We finally stumbled into a large room that looked like it had once been a common area. The walls were lined with cracked mirrors, their surfaces distorted and stained. In the center of the room was an old, decrepit wheelchair, its leather seat torn and frayed. That's when we heard it, the sound of metal scraping against metal, coming from somewhere above us. We both froze, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. Then, from one of the mirrors, a figure emerged. It was the same silhouette we had seen in the hall, but now it was clear. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered lab coat that dragged on the ground. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see the glint of metal where its eyes should have been. Dr. Grayson. He stepped out of the mirror, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. I could feel his gaze on us, cold and unfeeling, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her toward the door. But as we reached the threshold, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were trapped. The room grew darker, the shadows closing in around us. Dr. Grayson moved closer, his form shifting and distorting as if he were made of smoke. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay, and I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of a heartbeat, my heartbeat, pounding in my ears. "We need to get out of here," Lisa cried, her voice filled with terror. I turned to the mirrors, hoping to find some way out, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. The reflections showed not just us, but other figures, patients, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They reached out to us, their hands pressing against the glass, as if they were trying to pull us into their world. I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, and I looked down to see a hand, pale and skeletal, its fingers digging into my skin. It was pulling me toward the mirror, toward the darkness that waited on the other side. "Jake!" Lisa screamed, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me back. But it was too strong, too determined. I could feel myself slipping away, the room fading as the mirror's world consumed me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The hand released me, and the room was silent. Dr. Grayson was gone, the shadows receding, the mirrors once again empty. The door creaked open, and we didn't waste a second. We bolted out of the room, running blindly through the halls until we finally found our way back to the lobby. Tom and Sarah were already there, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They had seen things too, visions of the past, patients screaming for help, and the ever-present figure of Dr. Grayson, watching, waiting. "We need to get out of here," I said, breathless and shaken. We gathered our things, not caring about the gear we left behind, and made a beeline for the front doors. But as we stepped outside, I realized the truth. We were never meant to leave. The gates were closed, the path gone. The forest had closed in around the asylum, trapping us within its twisted grasp. And from the shadows I could see them, the spirits of Blackwood's patients, their hollow eyes staring at us, silently pleading for release. But there was no escape. The asylum had claimed us, just as it had claimed so many before, and Dr. Grayson was still there, waiting, ready to continue his work. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now as I write this. I know he's coming for me, for all of us. The asylum is alive, and it won't rest until we're all part of its dark history. We were fools to think we could escape. Blackwood has claimed us, and there's no way out. My name is Michael Harrington, a journalist with a penchant for digging into the unknown. It started innocently enough, an old story, a whispered rumor that spiraled into an obsession. I'd heard about a town that appeared on no maps, a ghostly place known only through fragmented tales and rare, faded photographs. They called it the Town of Whispers, a name that chilled me even before I knew its sinister reputation. According to legend, those who ventured in search of it were never seen again. Intrigue turned into fixation, and before long I found myself tracing old reports and tracking down the few who claimed to have seen it. They were all unreliable, each recounting a different version of the same story. A town that appeared under a sky swollen with gray, nestled in a valley perpetually shrouded in fog. The last known report was from decades ago, a photograph dated in the late 1950s, showing a dilapidated sign that read, "Welcome to Winfield." The photo was yellowed, the town behind the sign a blurry smudge. There was no record of a town by that name anywhere in the region, or on any map I could find. The pull was irresistible. I packed my things and set out, telling no one of my intentions. The less they knew, the less they could stop me. It took days of driving through desolate backroads, the GPS showing nothing but green and gray as I ventured further into the forgotten parts of the state. The sky seemed perpetually overcast, thick clouds hanging low as if weighed down by an unseen force. The deeper I drove, the more it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then I found it. It was dusk when I turned a corner and saw the sign, "Welcome to Winfield." The same sign from the photograph, the letters faded and peeling, the wood cracked with age. Behind it, the town spread out in a small valley, veiled in a thick fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. I parked my car on the outskirts, the engine humming uneasily as if it sensed something I couldn't. As I stepped out, the air was thick with silence, the kind that presses in on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every breath you take. I walked into the fog, feeling its cold fingers brush against my skin. The town was a snapshot of abandonment. Cars sat parked along the main street, doors ajar, their interiors gathering dust. Storefronts were frozen in time, some with displays still intact. I passed a diner where half-eaten meals sat on tables, the food now a desiccated memory of what it once was. There was no sign of life, no animals, not even birds in the sky. It was as if everything and everyone had vanished in an instant. I moved through the town with a mix of awe and dread, taking photographs and jotting down notes. The houses were the worst. Each one felt like a tomb. Family photos hung on walls, toys lay scattered on floors, beds were unmade. There were signs of a hasty departure, but no indication of where anyone had gone. It was as if they had simply disappeared into thin air. As I ventured deeper, the fog thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. It swirled around me, distorting sounds and shadows. I began to hear things, whispers faint and indistinct, coming from the fog. I tried to focus to discern the words, but they were maddeningly elusive, slipping away as soon as I thought I understood. Then I reached the town square. In the center stood a statue, weathered and worn, of a man in old-fashioned clothing. The plaque at its base was too eroded to read, the words lost to time. But as I stood there, I felt a presence, a weight of something unseen but unmistakably there. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the whispers had been, heavy and expectant. The fog seemed to thicken around me, and I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I turned to leave, but the fog had grown denser, swallowing up the town behind me. My path was obscured, and I couldn't see more than a few steps ahead. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind. I quickened my pace, trying to find my way back to the car, but every turn led me deeper into the fog, the town twisting and shifting around me like a labyrinth. I was lost. My phone's GPS was useless, showing nothing but static, the screen flickering before dying completely. My flashlight was swallowed by the fog, its beam barely piercing the gloom. The whispers started again, louder now, more insistent. They were all around me, closing in. I stumbled into an old church, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. Inside it was dark, the only light coming from a few broken stained glass windows. The pews were empty, the altar bare, but the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the church, shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure remained silent, but the whispers grew louder, echoing through the church, overlapping and intertwining until they were deafening. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate. I turned and ran, bursting out of the church and into the fog, the whispers chasing me, the figure's presence looming behind me. I didn't know where I was going. There was no direction, no sense of where the town ended or where I had entered. The fog was everywhere, thick and suffocating, the whispers now a chorus of voices, each one more desperate than the last. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog began to lift. I found myself standing on the outskirts of the town, the sign "Welcome to Winfield" looming behind me. The fog was dissipating, rolling back like a tide, revealing the town in its entirety. But something was different. Everything was aged, decayed beyond the years that had passed since the last known sighting. The town was crumbling, its buildings collapsing in on themselves, the cars rusted and broken. The diner was nothing but a shell, its interior a ruin. The houses were hollow, their windows shattered, their doors hanging off their hinges. And then I saw them, the townspeople. They were everywhere, standing in the streets, in the doorways, watching me. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their skin pale and stretched thin over their bones. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I backed away, stumbling over the uneven ground, but they were everywhere, closing in, their hollow eyes following me, accusing me. And then I understood the town didn't disappear, it was consumed, swallowed by the fog, its people trapped in a perpetual state of decay, waiting for the next unlucky soul to stumble upon their forgotten existence. I turned and ran, sprinting back to my car, but the path was gone. The town had shifted again, trapping me in its labyrinth. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices screaming in my ears, their words finally clear. "Join us." I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, how far I went, the town was always around me, the fog always at my heels, the whispers always in my ears. I don't know how long I've been here, days, weeks, months. Time has lost all meaning. The town is endless, its streets winding and twisting, leading nowhere. The whispers are my only company, their voices growing louder, more insistent as the fog closes in. I'm writing this in the hope that someone will find it, that someone will know what happened to me. But I fear that if you're reading this, it's already too late. The town is calling, and it's hungry,